thank you guys for coming. I know this is like a very hot topic, and hopefully this is going to help us all get on the same page. So we'll just take it away. Maybe, assuming I can get to the next slide, and I'm turning off my space here because it's a lot. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do today. First, we're gonna talk really quickly about like, why are we doing this in the first place? Then we're gonna talk about how to complete the compensation terms of both the listing agreement and the buyer rep. Nothing too crazy there. And then we're going to talk about like best practices for writing offer and documenting it with the new forms, kind of like we did on Monday. And then hopefully we can spend the bulk of the time walking through actual compensation scenarios and how to fill out the paperwork. Does that sound good? This is going to work best if you guys have questions. So I'm watching the chat. Angela's here and is watching the chat, and we will just get going. So thanks, guys. Okay, so first of all, like, why are we here? You've kind of heard this already, like, we all know about like the lawsuits that started basically last fall. There were some decisions about, collusion and price fixing and consumers not being educated. And so there was big old, several class action lawsuits, and we are having to change our best practices based on the settlement that National Association of Realtors made. And that's fine. In the past, in our MLS, we said like, this is what the seller is offering as buyer's agent commission through the listing broker. They decided that part of the lawsuit was that was unfair. So now our MLSs no longer allow us to input what the commission is, and we can't really put it anywhere. We can put it on our own website, but we can't put it elsewhere. So before that, when it was in the MLS, that was like a binding unilateral offer of compensation. So we didn't really need to document what it was between brokers. But now that we are in a position where it's not in the MLS, we do need to separately document like, what is the seller agreed to pay through the listing broker from the get-go. And that's where this compensation about brokers form comes in. So we will get there. Okay. Any questions so far? Giving you guys like the quick and dirty of stuff you pretty much already know. Good. Okay. Okay. So first we're going to go through just the listing agreement. We're not going over through the whole agreement, just like the terms regarding compensation and what it should look like. So these forms are new as of June. So if you have templates, you need to make sure that they're all fully updated. But this is what your listing agreement should look like. If the if the seller is like, yes, if you say, my fee is 3% plus a $395 administration fee, and then let's discuss what you want to offer to the buyer's broker upfront. And they're say, okay, great. And you talk about the pros and cons, and the seller says, I would also like to offer the buyer's broker 3%. So then that's what this looks like. 6% total plus our administration fee. And then from the amounts above, how much will be offered to pay to another broker. And then you put, 3% to the other broker, and Briggs Freeman does not do sub-agency. So that number should always be 0. So that's pretty straightforward in a listing agreement at 6% with 3% to both sides, plus our admin fee. That's what that one looks like. Questions? No. Okay. So then the next one, so say you have this conversation with your seller, you say, I charge 3% plus a $309 administration fee. What would you like to talk to the charge or offer to a buyer's broker? You go back and forth, and they say, I think I'm comfortable with 2.5%. So then that's what this looks like. You put, 5.5% total. And then from that, 2.5% is going to go to the buyer's broker. So pretty straightforward, right? Yes. Okay. So in the last instance, say you talk to your seller and your seller says, I'm just not really comfortable offering commission to the buyer's broker upfront. So I'm just going to pay you your fee, and we'll figure it out with respect to the buyer's broker. So I say, okay, fine. So then you fill out the bottom section now, and you fill out 5B, which says there's broker's fees without compensation for other broker. And that's 3% to Briggs Freeman plus our admin fee. Nothing is contemplated for the buyer's broker here. But you'll see this paragraph below it that says note about seller paying buyer's expenses. So in addition to paying the above broker's fees, seller may be asked by a buyer to contribute amount towards buyer's expenses, such as buyer's broker's fees or other expenses payable by buyer under a sales contract. And it says, see paragraph 11 regarding broker's authority to disclose possible seller contributions. So again, I had an agent call me last weekend and say, my seller, he said he'll pay some, but he doesn't want to agree to amount upfront, and I don't really know how to document. So in that case, the best way for that agent to document that is to say, you know, we're not upfront offering compensation to the buyer's broker, but the seller has given me in paragraph 11F of the listing agreement authority to say, I will consider contributing an amount towards the buyer's expenses. So that seller, that's why I say, I don't want you guys to get panicked if you say 0 or 2 or 1, because when you talk to the listing agent, you can say, well, is the seller, would the seller possibly pay more? And most likely the listing agent will say, well, it just depends on what the offer is. The seller's not agreeing to an amount up front, but with a great offer, they would pay, right? Or if you get to an agreement and then you say, okay, now I want you to pay 1% extra to cover my buyer's broker fee, then the seller is willing to do that. So in our Briggs Freeman opinion, the best practice is to say, yes, the seller does authorize to broker to share with other brokers that they're willing to contribute amount, assuming the seller is. If you have a seller that's like, I hate buyer's brokers, I'm never paying them, it's a big no, you're not authorized to disclose that, then you would have to check this box. Hopefully that's a very rare situation. And you just have to be mindful when you're working with sellers that like feel that adamantly about how unvaluable, I was gonna say invaluable, but that's not what that means, how unvaluable a buyer's agent is. Just be wary of that seller, right? You just have to kind of be aware. Does anyone have questions about the way these work now? So ideally, you know, you're getting, your seller is agreeing to pay some to the buyer's broker, hopefully a substantial fee. And also that they're willing to like authorize that they're willing to pay expenses, right? Like that's the goal, is that you can have this conversation with them and that they're saying like, yes. But even if they say, no, I'm offering 0 up front, but I would be open-minded, you definitely want this yes box checked in 11F that they do authorize you to share. Was that good? You guys know me, I talk fast. Good? Thumbs up? All right. Thank you, Sharon. Okay. So now on to the buyer's rep agreement. I'm gonna slow down a little bit here. Because
Zareen, Melinda just asked, what if they want a sliding scale?
so, I mean, if they want a sliding scale, that's hard. You have to figure out, what does that really mean? Like, what do you mean by a sliding scale? Like, clarify. Like if they're like, oh, well, I'll pay 3% at this price and 2% at this price and 1% at this price. Or what do you mean by sliding scale?
Melinda, do you want to unmute?
Yes, so they were saying depending on the sales price, they'd pay 2.5, or if it's less, they might only pay 2.
Okay, so in that case, and this is why you kind of have to think about it. In that case, they're saying, I at least want to market that I'm paying 2 so that I have buyers interested in it and they'll come and show. So in that case, I would put 2% to the buyers. That would, at the floors, if they're saying I'm willing to offer at least 2%, I would put 2% here. And then, you know, if you're getting a full 3, 5% here. So 5 and 2. And then I would check, yes, the seller is willing to contribute more. So it's tricky because I mean, the other option they could choose is to say, put 0. And then you and I know that there's a sliding scale depending on what the price is. So that's their other option, right?
So what happened on this one, this was like a week ago when I didn't really know what I was, well, still don't really know.
Fair enough.
Really. We signed that form that Angela said don't use except for special provisions. I forget.
Yeah, that's before we kind of had a big powwow last week and
Right,
decided we weren't
right.
going to use it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we put on there 2 to 2.5% that he's willing to advertise that. So he's been willing to let me tell other brokers 2.5 depending upon the offer.
Perfect. And this, let me show you, this is the form.
But I didn't fill this one out correctly, so I
This is
gotta
the
go back.
form that she's talking about. It's called seller's authorization to disclose and advertise certain information. It's not a document you're gonna need to use like all the time. Typically, you would only use it if the seller's like, yeah, I'm gonna allow you to offer, you can market that we're moving, or, you know, you can, if there's something very specific, or you can market that the roof will be replaced prior to closing. Like if you want to, if you have a very particular seller and you want to document exactly what you're allowed to say, then you use this document. Otherwise, you don't really need it. But in this case, Melinda, you know, checked this box here, or should check this box here, that seller does authorize broker to share. And then she clarified in this what she wanted. But generally speaking, you do not need this document. Does that help? Does that make sense, guys? Hopefully. Okay. Okay, so in the buyer's rep, you know, there's a short form that was put out. There is even like a touring form that Zillow has put out. And as a general rule of thumb, like those forms really don't protect you a whole lot other than checking the box that you have complied, right? And we're not like pop-up Zillow agents that will open doors for a fee, right? That's not like our model. That's not the type of agents that you guys are. So we have chosen to just use the long form, but you can modify the long form and fill out the terms in such a way that it's very restrictive and it shouldn't make a buyer feel overwhelmed. I do understand that before you go even show anyone a house, to ask them to sign a form can be challenging, but I think that that's something that in this changed environment, the agents who can get good at that are the ones that will really thrive. And if we can make it a best practice to sit down with our buyers before we tour, even briefly, it's like, okay, let's just go meet at this coffee shop for coffee for 15 minutes, and then we'll hit the road and go look at this house, and walk through this document. It's 5 pages. It's not, that's long, but it's not like a 12-page document, right? And you just kind of have to walk through it and explain and say, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to fill out this document today just to cover the 3 houses we're going to go see for it. So if you decide to buy one of these 3 houses, I would represent you, but you're not bound to me forever and ever. And so the way I would recommend filling that out is you can put specific property addresses. If you know you're going to work with them, I talked to an agent the other day, she's like, these clients are solid, no big deal. So she can put, you know, DFW Metroplex for a whole year, right? As her market area and her term. But that's how you kind of make this document stronger or less strong. You just have to remember, if you go on your first date and you put the 3 houses as the market, and then you decide to continue to work it, you do have to amend it to cover the whole market area. Does that make sense? And the term I would use, I would not just put 1 day. I would put like 2 months or 3 months if they're just wanting to date, because then you're protected on that house for that amount of days from another agent coming and like swooping up your client. Does that make sense? I'll tell you one thing. This class, we're not necessarily talking about like the nitty gritty of having like a really valuable and excellent buyer process and buyer consultation meeting and things like that. Like that's not what this class is about. We are going to have that class and let you guys share your best practices, because I know this is something that we all need to get really, really good at, is having, you know, obviously we're required to have buyers reps signed before we show a house, but convincing the buyers that you're worth your full fee. So we're going to practice that a lot. That's not what this class is about, but I just wanted to tell you guys that that's where we are on that. And if you're having great success, share with us so that we can share with other agents. Okay. Yeah. So Catherine's asking, can you use this form and list multiple addresses on their market area? Yes. So if you're like, we're just going to go out today for our first time and look at 1 house or 4 houses or whatever, absolutely. You can do it that way to just cover whatever you see that day, whether it's 1 house or a few houses. Good question. Okay, so that's page 1 of this document. Page 2, I wanted to show you, this one's pretty straightforward, but where you put in your fee, and this is just a blank form that only accepts numbers. So hopefully you're negotiating that your buyer will pay you, your buyer agrees that your value is 3%, which is what we hope we can charge. And you know, it does say here, you know, broker will seek to obtain payment of the fees specified here from the seller or their agents. And if they refuse, then client will pay broker the amount specified. So my recommendation is to say, like, we know there are sellers out there that are offering 3%. So let's put 3% in that blank. If we get into a negotiation and I can't get the sellers to cover my fee and you don't have the funds, like we can negotiate and modify it from there. But I think it's important to get the buyers to understand what your value is, and that hopefully you're gonna get it from the sellers, but if not, they may have to make up a little bit of it. So, and that you can even ask the seller to help them make it up through closing costs and things like that. Okay, again, not what this is about, but there. Protection period, always put at least 90 days. So, and then the last one, I just put this page in here, page 4 shows where the fee is in special provision, since there's no other spot. Okay, looking for the chat. Okay, so we're good. So, okay, so what are our best practices for writing offers now? We covered this somewhat in, well, not somewhat, we covered it in our Monday morning meeting, which hopefully you guys were all there. We did have good turnout, but we're gonna walk through this, and then we're gonna talk through compensation scenarios and what the paperwork going back and forth would look like there. So your first step, when you're writing an offer right now, is to figure out what is the seller offering as buyer agent commission. And so you can do that by either calling the listing broker and asking, or you can go to their website. I have not seen a lot of our websites working. I have not seen a lot of other websites that have them up yet. So right now you're probably making calls and having conversations, which is why it's even more important as a listing agent to know whether you have that box checked in 11F, right? Obviously, if they've said 3%, then you can say, yes, we're offering 3%, but if they're negotiable or they want to know that there's a scale, you need to make sure that box is checked. Okay, so then you have and I keep on saying boxes checked. It's not boxes checked, it's that they do authorize you to have that conversation. Okay, so then you show the house. And my recommendation, if you're showing a house where there's no compensation offered for you, or if it's less than what's in the buyer's rep agreement, you should let your buyer know beforehand. And I think you don't have to be like, hey, this is all about me, but you can just say, as we discussed, this is one where the seller's offering 2.5. So when we write our offer, we would have to ask them to contribute a little bit more. Just so that you
Doreen,
can,
yes,
yeah.
Steve has a question,
Okay.
saying that he was on a call with agents from across the country, and several of them said their lenders were able to add BAC onto the loan. And he's asking if this is now available or allowed in Texas, or does it depend on the lender?
I think it depends on the lender and the type of loan. So I do think as a buyer's agent, I mean, we've always said like it's a best practice to be really close with your buyer's loan officer and to kind of really know what they're dealing with, so that if you do ever ask for seller contributions in 12A1B of the contract, that you would know what that number could be. So yes, they can cover that. We were talking about this morning with the managers. It's better to put it on the addendum regarding brokers, but if you wanted to put it in 12A1B, you could do that. It's not ideal, but is this available or allowed in Texas? So when you say add on to the loan, that's a little bit tricky, because you're not adding it onto the loan per se. You're making it like a cost that can be paid and is allowed. Although maybe you're talking about the situation now where it's like the purchase price is 100 and the buyer is gonna get a loan for 103, because we're adding on commission there. I have not seen that yet, but it's a good question we can look into. I'll make a note.
Yeah, and
Doreen, I
Joy's
would,
saying that she heard VA lenders are doing that, which I've heard too. but-
Well, they're allowing them, so what they're allowing them to have closing costs paid for that go towards that. There's two different things, like can closing costs go towards buyer broker expenses as a cost versus can we add it to the loan and make it like a bigger loan? Those are two different questions, and I don't know the answer to the second question. The first
Yeah.
question, you would just have to ask the lender.
Serene, hi, it's Steve. So I should clarify basically what you were saying. It wasn't necessarily adding to the loan, obviously, because the loan is applicable to the asset that they're borrowing against. But more of can the lender, do they have like a separate loan or something that covers the closing costs, of which the BAC may be included within those closing costs?
You said a second loan?
Or I don't know,
A
it's probably the wrong
second
terminology, so I'm gonna confuse things. But basically, is there that I was on the call, they were saying that the BAC could be included as buyers' closing costs and in effect paid for by the
Yeah,
lender.
so So let's take a big step back. So here's the deal. So if I have a listing for $100,000 and my seller says, I'm not paying buyer broker commission, I'm not offering any buyer broker commission upfront. It's like, okay, fine. So we write an offer and we think it'll appraise. So we're like, we're going to write an offer for 100 and ask the seller to pay, 3% directly to me. And then effectively we're writing a $97,000 offer, right? The net to the seller is gonna look like that. And if the seller's like, no, I need to net 100, we could write an offer for 103. My numbers aren't perfect, but you know what I mean. And that 3% then could go, the seller would pay that directly to me. And if the seller's like, still no, then you're out of luck. Although that doesn't make sense because they're getting their list price. If we're offering 103 and asking them to pay 3% in concessions towards the buyer's costs. So it's going to be a question of nets and how this all works out. But
So I just pinged one of my lenders and asked the question. They said yes to both. You can either add it to the loan or have it covered under buyer's closing costs.
okay.
But also one other thing on that call on Monday that I was on, one thing that came up was if you write an offer and say you've got $1 million property and you offer 970, and then you're taking into account the buyer is paying the BAC and the seller's paying 0.
Mhm.
If you write it in such a way that that's actually beneficial for the seller because the seller's then paying 3% or whatever the listing agent's compensation is on 970, not $1 million.
Yeah, it's slightly,
Actually, they're winning on both sides.
little bit, yes, for sure. But the property, I'm imagining that the property would still have to appraise for $1 million if the buyer or whatever would get the LTV to $1 million if the buyer's asking for that much cash, right? If the buyer is asking to finance the cost of those commissions,
Oh no, that's what I
property's
meant.
gonna have to appraise.
I meant if the seller's not paying any compensation, the buyer's covering everything for the buyer's agent. So you offer them 970 to justify your offer of 970 instead of $1 million.
Yes,
You can say, well, you're not paying a compensation, plus you're also going to benefit on paying listing agent compensation based on 970, not based on $1 million.
yeah, it's 2% less or 3% less of $30,000, sure.
Yeah.
The challenge there, I'm guessing, Steve, is that if you're asking to tack additional amount into the loan, which I have not actually heard of, then the value is gonna have to be there in terms of the collateral, which is the appraisal. So that's a good question. I wrote it down. We'll like dive into that nuance. One thing that guys that we're talking about here is that we're all like learning this and doing this together. So the more things that you can share and experiences you can have, like we're just gonna get better at this. Sylvia's asking, are we permitted to add buyer's agent commission language in the social media posts? That's interesting. I mean, this isn't a question that I have directly discussed with the managers, but I will say that your social media, according to Trek, is considered a website. So I would think that would be fine. Angela, I don't know if you have a different opinion.
I'm thinking the same thing. Yeah, I think so. It doesn't feed directly to MLS. So I think
That's
you can
right.
do it.
Just can't be in the MLS. Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the same reason that you see like signs, you're starting to see signs that say like 3% BAC offered or whatever. So yeah, it just can't be in the MLS. So, okay. Good questions. I'm looking at the chat. We don't have anything new. Okay. So, once they decide to make an offer, then the first thing you're going to do is you're going to get the compensation agreement between brokers, 2402, executed prior to making the offer. And just like we were talking about at the beginning, like it used to be in the MLS that they're offering 3%, which is why we would say print out the MLS sheet so that we have a record of it so that they can't go change it after the fact. Well, since we don't have that in MLS anymore, we have to get this documented upfront. So our best practice is to get this documented and in writing before you write your offer, just to know. And then you can sit down with your buyer and say, look, I've got this compensation agreement. The seller is paying 3%, we're squared away, or I've got this compensation agreement between the brokers. The seller is going to pay 2.5% through their broker. So we only need to ask them for an additional 0.5%, or you need to come up with an additional 0.5% of cash or whatever you decide to do. So one thing, we're going to talk about this in more detail, but whatever you put in the compensation agreement between brokers will always just match whatever the listing agent sellers had told you to offer. That's not really negotiable. Like that's the agreement that the listing agent and the seller struck between the two of them. of how much the listing broker would offer to the buyer's broker out of their commission. So, that's not negotiable. Like, that's between them. So we just accept it and then we figure out how to make up the delta if there is one, right? Okay, so that agreement is between the buyer's broker and the listing broker. It does not get submitted with the offer. But now you're gonna have to document in the paperwork that's between the buyers and sellers, who's getting paid how much, and that's also all part of the negotiation. So you will include this addendum regarding broker's fees with every offer, unless it's an unrepresented buyer, or if the seller is not paying any of the buyer's agent commission and refuses to, right? And then you'll check the box in paragraph 22 of the TREC form to just reference the addendum regarding broker's fees. So let me show you. So these are the two new forms and we're gonna go over them. And this I put in here just so you guys could see. This is the box. When we say you have to check box, and this is the TREC 1 to 4, and you guys are all familiar with this, where you go through and you check third-party financing addendum and you check square footage disclosure if it's one of our listings, and you're always gonna have addendum regarding brokers and fees in here now, okay? Questions about that? Joy is saying she received an offer on one of her listings yesterday from an agent that didn't have that agreement between brokers. So in order to like document it, she didn't do like a gotcha and get to the closing table and be like, we're not paying anything. Like, she showed them how to do it the right way. And because you guys are educating yourselves on the right way to do this right now, I have a feeling that's going to happen a lot. And we're the best professionals in the industry, and we're going to probably pick up how to do this the right way fastest. And there will be a component of agent education in this. And there will also probably be a group of agents that don't figure it out and maybe won't be here in a year. Not you guys, but agents that don't have the right resources behind them to navigate these new strategies. So just do things the right way and be leaders in the industry when you're dealing with people. That said, different brokerages are going to have different recommendations and different best practices and different requirements. At Briggs Freeman, you know, Angela and I and Jennifer and John and Jason have all looked through these documents together and had like lengthy discussions about what is the right way to approach this and the right way to do this. And we feel like the way that we've kind of made our best practice is what protects you guys. And that's getting this compensation agreement signed up front and then always including that addendum regarding brokers' fees. So Sylvia's saying, if you don't have the agreement covered up, can't it be covered in the addendum? She says it's possible that not every agent will sign the agreement upfront, especially if commission is based on the offer amount. I mean, that's true, but if they have a listing agreement that says 3% to buyers, to selling broker and 2% to listing broker, like that's already their agreement. And that's why we do want to document it upfront. And you'll see in this, hold on, let me just go a couple slides ahead. In this document, it says this addendum confirms or creates an obligation. So you don't have to have it, but it's a best practice to have it because they could like double deal you, right? So I think if the seller's already agreed to pay a certain amount, you should get that signed up front. That is our kind of best practice. I think it's really risky to leave your commission on the table based on the offer if the seller has already agreed to pay an amount upfront. And that's a conversation you have with a listing agent who says like, I don't want to sign this. It's like, well, do you have a listing agreement that provides that the buyer's broker will be compensated? And if they're like, yes, then you can just say, okay, well, this is documenting what your listing agreement already says for the purposes of like transparency to me and my buyer, so we can figure out what we need to offer, right? That's kind of the conversation that needs to happen. It's not, you're not asking them for anything extra. It's what the seller has already agreed to. And if you write an offer that the seller doesn't like, they don't have to agree to it, right? So that's I think the best way to protect yourself upfront. And Sylvia says, okay, so if the seller isn't offering anything, then we don't submit the agreement. That's a great question and we're going to get there. But the short answer is, I would say no, but it depends if the listing agreement is like, my seller's never paying buyer's commission, you're out of luck, like too bad, never, 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 then I wouldn't add it. But at the same time, if the seller's asking $1 million and you offer $1.03 million, plus you add that addendum and say you want the seller to pay 3% directly to the buyer's broker, like they're getting what they wanted. So you can still always just submit it and see, because at the end of the day, it's about the seller's net. So hopefully that makes sense. I know, JB, I hear you. It's okay. We're gonna talk through very specific situations. So hold on, guys. I'm not gonna address any more specific until we get into the scenarios, because I think people are getting confused. So, okay, so this is the compensation agreement between brokers. This is the document that we say you should submit once you know we want to write an offer, so that you can find out what are they offering? What has the seller already agreed to pay? So you put listing broker, us, if we're the buyer's rep, what's the address, what's the name of the client, and then the term here should be the date that the date you're writing the offer, and then the date that your buyer's rep agreement ends is where I would put in that blank, because then you're covered for the whole time. Okay, we'll take a big step back, JB, and just listen right here. So this is a document that you're going to fill out with the amount that the seller has already agreed to pay. So either side can write it. As a listing agent, you can say, here's what we're offering, right? Or as the buyer's agent, you can say, okay, I called JB and she told me it was 2%. So I'm going to write this up and send it over to her before I write my offer. So either party can document this. I, as a buyer's broker, for sure want it documented. So that's the answer there, is that the buyer's broker really is the person who really wants this compensation agreement between brokers executed. So, because it's protecting you, right? Because before we had the MLS to protect us because they put 3% in there, or 2%, or whatever they were offering the buyer's broker, but we don't have that anymore. So we need some record of what the listing agreement says that the seller will pay the buyer's broker. Okay, so that's the buyer's broker. This protects the buyer's broker and documents what used to be documented in the MLS, but no longer is. So this is why you want this before you write your offer. You want to be able to tell your buyer when you sit down to write the offer, look, the listing broker has already agreed to pay me 3%, so you don't need to worry about it, or has already agreed to pay me 2.5%. So we only have to make up that 0.5%. So that's what this document does, is it clarifies what the seller has already agreed to pay a buyer's broker through the listing agreement, right? So ideally it should be executed prior to the offer submitted. You find out by calling them. The term, I would say, Susan's asking, it begins on, I would say, the day you're writing the offer, or the day you show the house, whatever you want, and ends on, I would say, whenever your buyer's representation agreement ends, right? So for as long as you represent this buyer, this broker is agreeing to pay you if this buyer buys this house. That's what I would put there when your buyer's rep ends. And then, whatever they have in the listing agreement that the seller has already agreed that the listing broker will pay out of their commission. Does that help? JB, are we feeling better about this? That was confusing, so I'm glad you slowed me down. This is the document that protects the buyer's agent. Angela or Jennifer, do you guys have anything to add? I can't see if Jason or John is on here, but managers, do you guys have anything to add?
No, I think that's basically it. It protects the buyer's agent, and it's because it's setting forth the contract. It's making the contract between the two agents that was built into Netris per all the brokerage's agreements with Netris, that it was a binding contract. We don't have that now.
Yeah, and it's not like we're asking, like if we call them and they say it's 2%, we're not going to write in 3% here. We're always just going to have, this is going to match whatever the listing agreement says. That does not mean that that's the end of the discussion. It just means that this is the part that we've all already agreed to. Now we got to figure out if there's anything left and who's paying for it. Does that help?
Zareen, it's Joy. Hey, could you and Angela, could one of you shed some clarity on, so we're going to send the compensation agreement between the brokers prior to submitting an offer. And we're going to write in there, it's going to depend and vary upon what the seller is willing to pay. So that communication is going to come from the listing agent. But regarding the addendum regarding broker's fees, which we're going to add as an addendum to the contract itself, what's the difference?
What's the difference between the two documents?
Yes, yeah. So the addendum between the broker's fee is going to become a part of the contract, obviously, if we're notating it as an addendum.
Yeah, so the difference is
Okay.
really this this is between the brokers, right? So this is the listing broker signs it and the buyer's broker signs it. So this is a document between the brokers documenting what the listing agreement already provides. So that's this, now that what the agreement between brokers is, it does a couple things. It you can document here what we put in D1, you're gonna document what we put in the compensation agreement between broker, that the listing broker has already agreed to. And then this is where you can ask for more from the seller, right? If you're like, look, we were gonna offer $1 million, but we're gonna add a little bit extra and ask the seller to pay it towards our fees, then you're gonna check box D to B. And we're gonna go through specific examples, so that's why this one's just blank for now. But this is showing everybody, right? This is showing the buyers, like listing a broker is paying the buyer's broker this much, right? As documented in our compensation agreement between brokers. And but we're also gonna ask for the seller to pay this much because the buyer doesn't have it, or the buyer doesn't want to pay, or whatever. They want it to be financed into the whole price of the loan. So that's where you can use this document for that. And please note, guys, as a buyer broker and as a listing broker, this says the listing broker, if you didn't do the compensation agreement between brokers and you check this box, it does reference the fact that it's contained in a separate written compensation agreement. So if you don't have that document, you're a little bit naked. Legally, I would argue. I just think if you want to protect yourself, you want that document. Because at the end of the day, the listing broker is not signing this document. They're not signing the addendum regarding broker's fees. They're not a party to it. So we can put a number in there, but if we don't have a document actually signed by the listing broker, like, that's not super helpful. Does that help? Does that make sense? So Pam is asking, should the compensation agreement be listed as other in item 22 of the offer? And that's no, because the parties to a contract are the buyer and the seller, and that compensation agreement is between the listing broker and the buyer's broker. So this is the part that deals with fees that the buyer and the seller are going to sign. So this is the only document that we need in paragraph 22. So hopefully that helps. Sorry, guys, I know this is clear as mud. Like, how are we feeling? Hold on, I'm just gonna go through and read the questions real sick. Susan says, if you have a buyer's rep for just a few days to show houses, do you amend that to for a longer term prior to writing an offer? And so this goes with the term question. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good idea. I think, and Angela, correct me if I'm wrong, I think in the way our representation documents work, that if you go under contract during the term, you're protected on that particular contract through the closing, even if the term has actually expired.
That is correct.
Yeah, so, that's a good question. Okay. So yeah, Joy, we're about to do some role play and look at specific scenarios, so sit tight. We just wanted to give you guys the foundation of what you need when. So, and what does what? Compensation agreement between brokers documents between the buyer's broker and the listing broker what the seller has already agreed to pay upfront. And the addendum regarding broker's fees is the document that the buyer and the seller sign, documenting already what the listing broker has said that they'll pay for the buyer's broker, and that's in D1. And then also documenting, is the buyer gonna ask the seller to pay any more towards other brokers' fees? So we're gonna go through these, and I think it'll help, and if it doesn't help at the end of the day, we're gonna keep doing scenarios until it does. So here's our scenarios. We did it, and we have a good amount of time left, so that's good. We just had to lay kind of the foundation. So if this is our best and easiest case scenario, and for the purposes of this, all of the illustrations we do and the collateral we give you, we're going to talk about 3% and 6%, and then like maybe 2% or whatever, but obviously fees are negotiable, and you might charge 4 on the listing side. And so, but for the purposes of these conversations, like, we're going to think in terms of 6% to make it clean and easy. Okay. So got to get my little CYA out there. So the first step you're going to do is if I have a listing agreement and it's for 6%, and Susan brings me her buyer and it's for 3%, and she calls me and she says, Zareen, what is your seller offering? And I said, my seller is offering 3%. And she says, great, we're going to write an offer. So she sends me the compensation agreement between brokers at 3%. and I sign it and I send it back to her. So she sits down with her buyers and she says, this seller's paying 3%. And our buyer's rep, you've agreed to pay 3%. So in our addendum regarding broker's fees, we're just gonna document that and we're gonna make sure it's part of the contract. So that's what this looks like. You fill out this compensation agreement between brokers, you have the buyer name, this representation start date, the date that it ends, and then you put, you know, this is the compensation agreement between brokers, 3%. I'm gonna sign it as the listing agent, Susan's gonna sign it as the buyer's agent, and we're good to go. So then we're gonna write our offer. And it's not working for some reason. I think I can press space bar. Okay. And so then this is what the addendum regarding broker's fees will look like here. So when we write the offer, we're gonna say, the listing broker will pay 3% as contained in our separate written compensation agreement. And the seller's like, yep. And the buyer's like, yep. And we're good to go. And we attach it in to the offer, and it's referenced in paragraph 22 of the TREC contract, and we're squared away. Good. That's our best case scenario. And we love that. It's easy. Does that make sense to you guys? We feel comfortable doing that now? Yes. Thank you, Sharon. Love the thumbs up. Okay. So now let's talk about the situation where Susan's buyer's rep says 3, but my seller has said they'd only offer 2. But that yes, they might be negotiable to closing costs, right? We said seller does authorize me to say yes. So she calls me and she says, Serene, what are you offering? And I said, seller is offering 2 to the buyer's agent. She says, okay, great. She sends me the compensation agreement. It's filled out for 2% because that's what we know, even though her buyer's rep says 3. So she sits down with her buyer and she says, okay, here's the deal. The seller is agreeing to pay 2, but my fee is 3. So we got to make up that extra percentage. And we have a few options here. And the first one is the buyer can pay the fee separately. And that's the scenario maybe that Steve's talking about, where you add it on top of the loan or whatever. And the buyer's like, yeah, I have that extra cash to pay you the 1%. So Briggs Freeman will put the CDA together and request, you know, the 2% from the listing broker and the 1% from the buyer, and they'll send it to the title company, and the title company is going to say, this is the buyer needs their cash to close, which will include that 1%. Okay. So that's one option, is that the buyer's like, yeah, I have the 1%. I agreed to pay you 3, seller's only paying 2. I'll pay it. That's one option. The second option is you request the fee directly from the sellers using the addendum regarding broker's fees. And we're going to look at what that looks like. And then the third option is the buyer says, well, too bad, so sad for you. Like, we just have to amend the buyer's rep. And what I would recommend in that case is that you can amend your buyer's rep down to 2% for that property only. I wouldn't do a general one, because then going forward, if this deal doesn't work out, you're at 2%. So I would amend the buyer's rep for that property only. So those are your options when you sit down with your buyer to write your offer. And this is what the compensation agreement between brokers looks like. This. Susan called me, it's 2%. She says, okay, great. She sends it over. We both sign it. She sits down with her buyer and says, yeah, they're going to pay me 2. So we still have this 1% lingering out there. How are we going to cover it? And the buyer says, well, let's ask the seller to pay for it, right? And let's just make my offer a little bit higher. And so we check, when we fill out this addendum writing of broker's fees that's going to go in the offer, we put listing broker will pay 2%, right? That we agreed upon. And we're also saying that the seller will pay 1% towards other brokers' fees. So then you're squared away there, and the seller says, sure, this is a really good offer. It's better than I was expecting. I'm netting what I wanted to do. I'll sign this. Or they counter back and they say, no, 0. Or they say, we'll pay half, and the buyer only has to bring half, right? So there's different ways to kind of skin that cat, but it's always worth asking, like, will the seller pay the delta, the difference, right? And just one thing I forgot to mention, what this 2A is for is a situation where it's like a for sale by owner. And there's no, it's like the registration agreement between broker and owner. It's like a for sale by owner. That would document that here. That would be between the broker and the owner. And then this would document between the seller and the owner. If you use 2A. So for the most part, you're not going to use 2A. Unless it's a seller that it's a FSBO, basically. Okay. So does this help? Does this make sense? Do you guys want to go back and just see this again? So this is the situation. Seller's offering 2, buyer's offering 3, and these are your options. Buyer can pay it separately. or buyer can request the fee directly from the sellers, which I think is always worth a shot. Or you have to just reduce your buyer's rep on this particular property. Does that make sense? Who has questions? This is where we're gonna have to be really good at articulating our value to our buyer so that they're not, you just should reduce your fee, right? They should be like, yeah, you're super helpful and I want you to get paid. I can send out the slides, more helpful. We have like a really good, handout we're gonna give to you guys. I'm actually waiting. I can't see any of my screens, but as soon as Maria sends it to me, everyone who came to this class will circulate it so that you guys have it. Is this the slide, Joy, you wanted to see?
The one before this,
Okay,
I just want to take a screenshot of it.
sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the flow chart we're gonna send you like has each of these three options like laid out. So you guys will be able to reference it and be like, what situation am I in? What are my options? What do I need to do? Good?
Good. Thank
Okay.
you.
All right.
Hey, Zareen, just for my understanding here, it's Blake. I guess really just the addendum regarding brokers' fees is just so everyone sees it on paper there, buyers and sellers there, and really for title company as well. So when they do that CDA at the end of the day, they know all their numbers are clear. And the agreement between brokers is just to kind of have the numbers up front and know where you stand and kind of where they're at too as well, correct? For the
Yeah, so the agreement between brokers is just to document what the seller has already agreed with the listing broker to pay, because the MLS used to do that for us and it doesn't anymore. So that's what that is for. And then this one is to, it's not, this one isn't just for informational purposes only, because you are negotiating somewhat here, because you're asking the seller like, hey, you know, I know you said 2% to the listing broker, but if I offer you this much, would you pay this 1 extra percent so that I can pay my broker? Right? So it's for information purposes, but there is also some negotiating that's happening on this document. Okay,
That makes sense. Thank you.
okay, perfect.
Zareen, can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay. So if we have a buyer's rep, so whether or not it's just open-ended on properties or we've listed, like Catherine was saying, like 3 properties that we're going to see. So if one of them is not paying and we amend our buyer's rep with them for that one property, I will take less than what our
Yes.
buyer's, okay. How do we do that? What does that look like?
so, ooh, that's a good question. And the question is, did I keep that document in my little PowerPoint? Because it was not one I was gonna cover. Amendment to representation agreement. So, John, is this the right form? No.
No, the
No,
right
that's
one's
the
gonna
old one.
be,
Okay,
Um,
that's not, this is a different form. So you're just gonna have to do it. I think there's an amendment to representation agreement form. That you'll have to just fill out, and you can just say in special provisions for this particular property, brokerage compensation will be this percentage. And that way it's amended to just that. Is that for just that property? Does that answer your question? I'll send you
Yes.
that form too. And also just call us, like,
Yeah.
the managers are like up to their ears in this at this point, so they'll be well versed in how to help you. Don't be shy. But I'll send that as well. And I see the request for the slide, so I'm making a note. Okay. Joy says it's 15:05.
I can drop it in the chat, Zareen, if that's
Oh,
helpful.
John, that would be amazing. Thank you. You're the best. Okay, so we feel good about the situation where the seller's offering less than what our buyer rep says. I mean, we don't feel good about it, but we know how to handle it, right? Okay. So what we're gonna do there, once again, is we're gonna put in what we've already agreed to, what the seller already agreed to, and then we're gonna ask them to pay the extra. So you can see on the listing side, when you get these, there's gonna be a little bit more like mental gymnastics of figuring out what is really your best offer, right? Because to Steve's point, if you have 970 with, but you're paying 3% commission, but you're not paying any commission, but you have 980, but they've asked you to pay 3%, you're gonna have to, it's just looking at the nets, right? So that's gonna take a little bit more figuring out, but that's okay. That's why we're worth our full fee. Okay. All right, so then the next one is, I see a big, long question, which we will get to, Sean, but I'm gonna go through
Green?
this. Yeah,
Very quickly on the back of that, another thing I had on that was discussed on that call on Monday I was on was, I thought it was a great idea, is when you write an offer, write the seller's net sheet and include that, obviously probably excluding the fact of their loan payoff, which you may not know, but give them a seller's net sheet with your offer so they can see very clearly what your
Yeah,
offer,
yeah.
what they're going to net, less any money they may owe as far as mortgages, etc.
Yes, and
Um,
I've been talking to Randy and Josh about this, and they're happy to like help you take your offers and do all the net sheets and let you really be able to sit down with your seller and compare apples to apples. Cause I think that that'll be kind of important, because at the end of the day, if a seller is like, I'll never pay buyer's agent commission, but the one offer they get that has buyer's agent commission nets them more, they may be willing to reconsider that position, right? So it's
you may
just,
be dealing with a seller's agent that doesn't understand how to communicate. I know I
yeah,
lost when I bought my house. The previous house to this one, I lost a deal because the seller's agent didn't know how to communicate the fact I was giving back the 3% commission. So
Yeah.
I lost the deal because of that, because they
Yeah.
went for a higher offer. So
Yeah.
we can't assume that the listing agent knows how to do their job.
right, right. And we don't, and we probably should assume that they don't. Sorry. And we don't, we can't really, as a buyer and the buyer's broker, like we can't really interfere with what the seller and the listing agent have agreed to for the listing agent's commission, which is why we're just saying like, tell us what it is and we're gonna work from there. That's kind of how that goes. I think lots of buyers write, like non-represented buyers will write an offer because they think they're saving 3%, but that's not really in the listing agreement, right? So we just have to kind of finesse that. Sylvia, I hear you. That's a good idea. So, okay, so Sean is saying, this is an interesting little pickle. On the buy side, he submitted both forms at 3%, with the offer after the listing agent said it was 2%, and they accepted it and executed the contract that is under the current list price. I did check D1 on the addendum regarding broker's fee, so it's not an additional cost to the sellers. So if you check to D1, let's look at that. Hold on, I'm going back to it. So, okay, you checked D1 that the listing agent would pay you 3%, even though they said it was only 2.5%. I assume that the additional 5% is coming from the listing broker portion. Okay, so in a perfect world, like this is a little bit tricky, so I wouldn't recommend filling out the compensation between brokers different than what they said. But it is.
So I did it on both forms. And so the sellers also signed the compensation agreement saying that the listing agent was paying me 3.
Yeah, so, and maybe the listing broker said, fine, because this offer is so good, like, or because I want to get the deal done, like, I'll take a 0.5% less and I'm gonna give it to them.
I would
Sure.
assume, yeah.
Yeah, but that's not like, I don't think that's a traditional way to do it, is just send over the compensation agreement for whatever your compensation is. I think that makes it a little bit harder for everyone to kind of understand. But good for you if it's gonna work out, and that the listing agent should never have signed the compensation agreement between brokers at a price that's different than what they agreed to the seller, unless they were willing to give up their own commission, their own portion of the commission, right? So,
Well,
it's,
I assume that's what happened, but then the buyer's rep agreement we have is at 3%. And, per the rep agreement, I'm supposed to try to get all 3 from the other side. So we submitted it together with the offer.
true. Yeah, so, and if they signed it, either because they didn't know what they were doing, or because they were like, even though I told you 2.5, I'm gonna give you a half of mine, that kind of is what it is. But I think as a best practice, that's the right way to do it, is, so good, I'm happy that it worked out for you, that's awesome. I think as a best practice, the right way to do it is to make your compensation agreement match what they've already said.
Okay, now that I know moving forward, what if it's a situation where the listing agent has not been authorized to market a BAC? Instead of, what do I assume it is then? Can I not submit the same thing again and ask for all 3?
Well, so if they've said, if they have it in there, they need to tell you, right?
Got it.
So, but if it's 0, and this is a situation actually we're about to talk about, where when seller is offering none, right? This is where I don't want you guys to like panic or be like, I'm not showing that house. Obviously you need to show all houses. But it doesn't mean that that's the end of the world. That seller, it may just be like similar to Melinda's situation where the seller's like, well, I'll pay commission, but I want to see the offers first, right? I don't think that's wildly unreasonable for a seller to say. So I don't think we all need to freak out if we see 0%. We need to call the listing agent and say, is your seller just entirely unwilling to pay a buyer's broker ever? Or would they consider, depending on the offer? And most likely, they're gonna say they would consider depending on the offer. If the seller said you're not authorized, they're gonna say, I'm not authorized to say that the seller is willing to do anything. So, and then it's still a negotiation, right? So here's your options. If it's 0, then you can, the buyer can pay it directly to the buyer's broker, right? And then there would be no addendum regarding broker's fees in that case. And then what will happen is Briggs Freeman will submit the CDA requesting payment directly from the buyer. And also, if that's the situation where the buyer's like, I'm just gonna pay it, you need to make sure that you're in contact with their lender and that their lender is like, yeah, they have the funds to pay you, right? They have enough cash at closing to pay, their down payment and their closing costs and your commission. So that's one option. The more preferable option is that you request the fee from the sellers using the addendum regarding broker's fees and, put it in the paragraph 22 of the contract. I don't think that if you see 0, that you should totally freak out, because I think that a reasonable seller might say, I'm not offering anything upfront. I want to see what the offer looks like, right? Because we've all had terrible agents who are making a full fee who are made the deal more difficult and didn't deserve a full fee, right? So in that case, the seller can like pick and choose, how much am I paying based on the quality of the offer? And do I even think this agent can get this deal done, right? So that's my opinion. So if the seller's not offering any buyer's agent's commission, where it's 0%, but your buyer's rep says 3, then don't panic, call the listing agent, see if they've checked yes and 11 and F, and if the seller might pay some directly. And even if they have not checked yes and they're not authorized to discuss it, I still think you should submit and ask, right? If you submit a full price offer and ask for your buyer's broker's fees to be paid, or even an over ask and ask, like, what seller is going to say no if they're netting what they want? So you'll see, normally this was when I had the slide that said, well, this is what the compensation agreement between brokers should look like, but there won't be one here because there's no compensation coming from the listing broker. So we won't have that form in this instance, but we will have this form if we're going to ask the seller to pay. So you just write your offer and then you say seller will pay whatever your buyer's rep says. And then they can see, okay, well, this is an amazing offer and they're asking for 3% and I'm fine with that. Or they'll negotiate back and they'll say, okay, 2%. And then you got to get 1% from your buyers, whatever it looks like. Okay. So, Julie's asking if the seller has agreed to 3% upfront but gets a low offer, can they change their mind at that point? So the answer, so here's the deal. If the buyer has a compensation agreement between brokers signed, the answer is pretty much no. But they can also just say no with the full 3% commission in there. My seller would never pay that price, but you can resubmit your offer. And then that's putting it between the buyer and their broker to figure out what's the right price at this commission. Right. And then that's where the buyer and the buyer's broker has to figure that out. Does that answer your question, Julie? So you're never bound to actually sign a contract and pay that amount. If you don't get if the seller doesn't get the price they want, they don't have to pay anyone anything, right? So it's all a negotiation. Okay, I'm looking to see if we have questions. Like, how are we doing here?
I thought that there was one document that said that the commission, they weren't beholden to that in the event that they got a low offer, and I'm trying to think of which one that was. It was like
well, the listing agreement says that, the commission is earned if you get, X, Y, and Z. So if they don't get an offer that they like, they don't have to pay anyone anything. They would never have to sign a contract. I think the counter to that situation is, we got your offer, this offer at this price with this much commission going to the buyer's broker does not net my seller what he needs. So, and then see where it goes from there. Angela or Jennifer or John, you guys have anything to add? in that situation? Like I said, we're still all fleshing these out together, so it's good to ask questions and talk through it.
Yeah, I can't say, I don't know that I've heard of that document that Sylvia is referring to. I can look for it, but no, I think you've explained that particular
Yeah.
instance pretty well.
Yeah, it's like, yes, so if the listing agreement basically says like, we'll pay this commission if you sell it at this price, but if you don't get what they want, like. The seller never has to sign a deal that they don't want to sign.
On the listing side, if a seller is not paying a commit, they have 3% in their listing agreement to their listing agent and nothing going to a buyer's agent. And then Joe Blow comes and wants to make an offer. So we don't have, is there language in the listing agreement that's, what is your, I mean, I know technically what your responsibility is as a listing agent, fiduciary, but like, are you stuck with having to basically work that other side for no money?
If you're representing the buyer,
The seller. If you're a listing agent, it's 3% listing agreement,
Uh-huh.
0 going to a buyer's agent, and then someone unrepresented comes along. So they're not, I mean, they don't have a buyer's agents, or, buyer's rep agreement to worry about because they don't have a buyer's rep.
yes.
You're the only agent in the transaction.
So this is a great question. I'm so glad you asked it. So this is where it goes to part of our discussion with our sellers needs to be with respect to intermediary situations and unrepresented buyers and what that looks like. So I think we're actually internally talking about if we have an unrepresented buyer, do we need like an additional document that both, because right now we have that acknowledgement of non-representation that the buyer has to sign that basically is like, this is on you, but there's also some risk for the sellers. So we're contemplating having a document that the sellers would also need to sign. And maybe in that we could say like, because this buyer is unrepresented, like we're charging this. Well, ideally what we would do is say like, we don't really work with, we have a partner company in Canada that says like, we don't work with unrepresented buyers because there's too much liability for both the seller and the listing broker. I think that's an extreme position, but that's what one of our sister companies does. Because I think we would have to, I think that's something you need to address with your sellers upfront. If an unrepresented buyer approaches us, and really, if it's a 0% situation, you have to say like, we're gonna charge you more, because they're just more work and more liability. If it's a situation where they have agreed to pay some compensation, like you're gonna get the full amount, right? That's how the listing agreements work. That's which buyers don't realize is they think they're saving money by not being represented, but they're actually not because you're getting paid 6%
Right.
regardless. Yeah. But that's a good question. And actually that's adding like a new wrinkle. See, guys, this is why this is helpful for us to talk about. Like it's all new. So we're still figuring this out too, but we've talked about this like non-represented buyer document and for sellers to sign, not just for buyers to sign. And that might be an interesting way to say, okay, well, you said 0, Mr. Seller, but we're gonna get some extra or something. So that's helpful. Thanks. No, Jennifer's saying, do you say we don't work with unrepresented buyers? I did not say that. I said that we have a sister company that will not, because it's so much liability as the listing broker and on the seller kind of also to have like an uneducated buyer. So they don't, we do, but we're trying to think about what's the best way to do that to like mitigate risk and make sure that you're not in the situation that Sylvia is talking about where you have to work for both people and don't make any extra money. So that's where we are. Okay. So then this last situation, we're sorry guys, it's 2 o'clock. If you need to go, you are welcome to go. If you don't put your name and license number in the chat, you were never here and I don't know that. So please do that so that I can make sure you get CE credit. We're gonna do this class again and more. We're doing it in all the different offices. So if you want to do it again, you can. We'll expand on it. We have a different CE class approved that we can offer. But let's talk about this situation real quick. Or if you're in a situation where what the seller is offering is greater, that's what's in your buyer's rep. First of all, we're going to say this should not happen because our best practice is to negotiate, you know, our 3% and $395 admin fee on our agreements. Because you have to say to them, like, this can always be amended down. But if the seller is offering more than what the buyer's rep says, you're never gonna get that compensation as the agent, right? So this is why it's really, really important to articulate to your seller, like, we are seeing the amount that I'm asking you to agree to in my buyer's rep agreement, we are seeing that a lot in the marketplace, and a lot of sellers are paying that, so that's really what this document should say. If we get in a situation, I'm gonna work really hard to make sure that the seller pays for my commission, regardless of what they're actually offering. If we get into a situation where there's just no move, like, we can always amend my agreement down. That's what I would say. It's really hard to amend it up. Because what's gonna happen is, you know, the compensation agreement between brokers should match what the seller is offering. And then you include the addendum regarding fees and you check the box 22, and then there's gonna be extra commission, right? So you have to amend your buyer's rep so that if the seller's offering 3 and your buyer's rep said 2, you should amend your buyer's rep and take that 3%, right? And then you can keep it if the buyer will let you, or you could offer to rebate all or a portion of it back to the buyer. And then if you're in that situation, you want to rebate some of it back, like, we can help you document it. But hopefully this never happens where our buyer's rep is lower than what the seller is offering. So, okay. So questions, which we definitely have. I'm going to put this slide up so that you guys can see upcoming trainings. These are all in person. And this one's recorded because I know lots of people asked for that, but let's see, I saw one question up here. Casey says, if we have the listing and we now represent a buyer, what would need to be entered in the broker compensation and the buyer's rep? In this particular situation, the buyer rep is property specific. I mean, I would it's a good question. Hold on, please hold. Good question, Casey. It's like I planted you. So what do I do in an intermediary situation? If it's intermediary without appointment, meaning you're the listing agent and you're going to do both sides, highly recommend against that because there's a lot of peril there. And it's lots of liability involved, but occasionally it makes sense and is appropriate. If it's intermediary if it's intermediary without appointment, it's just you don't have to document anything else. If it's intermediary with appointment, which is the situation Casey's talking about, you document the commission the same way you would as if it were at a different brokerage, just so that we're all on the same page about who's getting paid how much. Okay. So Casey, in that case, you would put whatever, if we have the listing and we now represent a buyer, that would be entered in the broker's compensation. So you make it match as if it were a different broker. Call me if that is confusing. So I'm going through. Okay. All right, guys. So everyone's brain is full, I'm sure. We can keep going through specific questions if you want. This is a lot and it's all hard and new, but we're slogging through it and learning our best practices. Do you guys feel better equipped now to navigate this kind of stuff? Slightly, at least? Is everyone overwhelmed? You're laughing, so that's good.
I have a question. That's current.
Okay, what's up?
For which form did you show us? Or maybe you didn't. Do we need to use if we have a listing and we need to make an adjustment since we're coming into August 17th? We're supposed to do some kind of amendment.
It's this one, the amendment to the representation agreement. So this basically, if you have an old listing that was executed before June 24th, and it's not under contract, then you need to sign this document by August 17th. It just brings it current. Or same thing with a buyer's rep. If you have a buyer you've been working with since before June 24th, you need to amend, and they're not under contract, you need to amend your buyer's rep with this document.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. All right, who else has questions? I know there's a million questions, so don't be shy. Like, the managers are so well versed in this. You can call me. You're gonna come up with someone's gonna come have some new weird experience tonight. So just share with us and we're gonna keep talking about it. Okay? Does a seller's agent have to verify that the buyer's agent has an agreement? That's a good question. No, that's not the short answer to your question is, it is not the duty of a listing agent to be verifying that your buyer's brokers have representation agreements, what they are required to have. Now, if you're in a situation where you think they don't and you want to make a complaint with the Texas Association of Realtors because they're not in compliance with the law, you are welcome to do that. But it is not our duty to ask for copies of their buyer's rep. The Venmo is CG Partners. And basically we use this money from the Venmo guys to like get more classes approved and to take other continuing education classes that we have to get certified in, that's expensive. So that's what this all goes towards. Okay. Are we good? Speak now. Come to more classes. We're gonna keep talking about this at the Monday morning meetings. Susan saying, I used the new form at the beginning of the live, but I did not check 11F to say that they will consider. Do I need to amend that? Did you check nothing or did you check that they do not authorize you? How about I move this here?
I checked it do not because I didn't know what to do.
No, that's okay. As we all are learning, right? No worries.
And they were offering 3%. So we
Okay.
just had the conversation that there's not going to be anything extra anyway.
Yeah, so then I
But-
mean, in that case, I don't think you need to amend it. You can say they're offering 3%. And just because
Okay.
you don't need to amend it because that doesn't mean that they can't ask, right?
Okay.
But if you're offering 3, I really wouldn't worry about it. So
Okay. Thank you.
okay. Good question. All right, guys. Well, thank you. I'm sticking around if anyone has more questions. I know this is like mental gymnastics, but we'll get there.